Hey there, folks. Dan Clark with you again from Arcane Botanica. This was a presentation I gave to a quarterly gathering of the Australian Plant Society New South Wales. We went to the Hills District in May 2024, and I just gave this talk on my experience with the threatened flora on the Cumberland Plain of Western Sydney. I just got asked to summarise it and make it available after I presented it, so hence this presentation. But if you're interested at all in some of the threatened flora on the Cumberland Plain, as well as the Cumberland Plain generally, that's what this talk's about here. There's a fair bit in it. I think I spoke for about an hour, so you know, I don't expect you to hang around for that long, but it's just here for the members who want to see it. The Cumberland Plain, so yeah, the quarterly gathering was in the Hills Group, the Hills District, I should say, which is now a combination, I think, of Parramatta and Hills LGAs, I think. But this map here is pretty much what they define the Cumberland Plain as. So this is the part of the Sydney Basin where what it's defined by really for us ecologists is it's got shale soil. It's got clay soils derived from shale with, say, some alluvium mapped on the creeks. So in these sort of areas here, these wide areas, that's dominated by the Hawkesbury sandstone. And as it goes up into the Blue Mountains, goes from sort of Hawkesbury sandstone into the Narrabeen series and Narrabeen sandstones up there. And the Hawkesbury sandstone can sort of extend down here into the what we call the Southern Highlands, so Invercargill as well. But in Western Sydney here, we've got a clay deposit. And where it's sort of relevant is, or one way it's relevant is when the early invaders, if you like, settlers, colonists got to Sydney and took over the place in 1788 and onwards. They weren't very successful growing crops because they were on the Hawkesbury sandstone country, especially in the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. Sorry, where are we? Up here, I think. Cook came in there, but the colonists came in here. So you know, really nutrient poor soils associated with the Hawkesbury sandstone, and crops were very hard to grow. But when some, you know, explorers and I guess got out to this area, Liverpool, Parramatta, which they got to early on, Campbelltown maybe, they found that there was a change in the soil, and it went to a clay-based soil, and this was more amenable to having farms, to having livestock and possibly getting some crops growing. So it became very important for the establishment of Sydney. You can read some really good stuff about the formation of the Sydney Basin. It's a 300 million year process for what we've got today, or it goes back 300 million years. Basically, in a nutshell, I might not do justice to this, but the Sydney Basin as it was back then, and the mind boggles, it's so long ago, but it was really a sort of low-lying area of tropical swamps, tropical swampland in that time of Gondwana, where Australia, New Zealand, Africa, South America, India was all joined together in this huge supercontinent. South America wasn't joined to North America at that point, which I always find that interesting. But so the Sydney area was very different, probably unrecognisable than what we know today, but consisted of a lot of tropical swamps, and then a huge amount of sand has just flowed out with what they sort of think is millions of years of sort of heavy rainfall on average has flowed out of Antarctica. So all of this sand has flowed out of Antarctica along these massive river deltas and has come into the Sydney Basin and pretty much buried everything that was there. So around the edges of Sydney and where I am in Sutherland and a lot of suburbs, you know, through this area too, we've got Hawkesbury sandstone. We've got this really iconic sort of Sydney sandstone, or Hawkesbury sandstone is a geological feature. and it's meters thick. You can get 20, 30, 40 meter walls of it in some bushland areas in some places. I've got sandstone all through my front yard and backyard here in the Sutherland area, and it's all been transported. The geologists will tell you through their forensic research, it's all been transported from Antarctica, which is pretty amazing. All those tropical swamps have been buried and they've turned into coal. So they are now coal measures underneath the Hawkesbury sandstone generally. And then you got a bit of filtration out of finer sediments, which were predominantly, clay-based and other, lighter sediments has sort of got to the top. So shale came in with the Hawkesbury sandstone as well, and finer sediments, and they have sort of formed here on the Cumberland Plain, and they sit above the sandstone. They sort of sit on top, and the sandstone's sort of all been buried underneath, and where the sandstone outcrops, that can typically be at lower altitudes or higher altitudes or whatever around the side here. Definitely the Blue Mountains, you're going up in a higher altitude. So the Sydney Basin gets described as this sort of lopsided bowl or lopsided saucer or basin where different sediments, there's been geological sorting, but the main thing about the Cumberland Plain is you've got this finer shale clay-based soil sort of sitting on top or sitting above the sandstone here. And, makes for a different flora, makes for a very different flora in this Western Sydney area. It's lower rainfall here generally. It's sort of lower with higher maximum temperatures. So we've got lower rainfall, higher maximum temperatures compared to these areas most of the time. And they talk here that this area sort of exists in a rain shadow, a bit of a rain shadow, with almost sort of half the average rainfall that the areas sort of here get. And that's because of the Blue Mountains. So the rise of the Blue Mountains making a sort of rain shadow in this particular area here. Campbelltown and Penrith, the rainfall's a fair bit lower. But for a very good read of what I've just gone on about, just dive into a book like this and get into the early pages. This was a book about Sydney bushland written in about 1990. Doug Benson and Jocelyn Howe out of the Botanic Garden, Sydney. Have a read. Get hold of some books like that, and they got very good geological explanation sections in the front, pages. And I can think of another good book called A Day in the Bush, and I forget who one of the authors is Tony Rod, and I forget who the other author is, I'm sorry to say, but it's called A Day in the Bush. It's a little pocket guide. It's got an awesome explanation of the formation of the Sydney Basin in the early pages. So don't just run with what I've said. Have a really good look at that. Just covering more recently, a guy called Peter Ridgway, who works at Local Land Services, he has put out this book recently, Walking the Last of Western Sydney's Woodland. So the thing about this Cumberland Plain area is, as I'll show in the next couple of slides, it's been developed to within an inch of its life, and we've only got a sort of handful of bushland reserves and remnants left compared to what was here in 1788. So Peter Ridgway's written this one, which is a very sort of emotional and very sort of comprehensive take on these Western Sydney woodlands, mainly on the Cumberland Plain, that have been reduced to within an inch of their life just because of the pressures of urban development in Sydney. Just told the group that you can download these geology maps, and they're free. They're freely available. So I think this is a geological map of the Penrith area, or this. It's either the Penrith sheet or the Sydney sheet. I think this is the Penrith. Yeah, sorry, up the top there. And just to know that these are freely available, you can download them. I have put the website in before, but the website tends to keep changing there. If you just Google New South Wales geological maps, you can download a JPEG like this. it used to be on the New South Wales some New South Wales resources webpage, government webpage. Just see where it is now. But as far as I know, I mean, I've downloaded this so many times over the last 10, 15 years, probably downloaded it about, 50 times. So you can download this, and you can just, they're old maps, but you can zoom in on your local area, and you can look at the substrates that have been mapped. Now, the colours are very similar, and I sort of wish they were a bit different, but this sort of genuine blue-grey colour here is the Hawkesbury sandstone, and that's been all mapped through there. And this sort of lighter bluey green is what we call the Waiata Group shales, and this is a Bringelly shale subgroup of the Waiata Group shales, and that's mapped all through here in this larger Penrith area, coming out here to Parramatta and Blacktown and those suburbs of Western Sydney. The yellow is Quaternary alluvium. That's mapped along the watercourses more often than not. So where you got some creek lines on the Cumberland Plain, we tend to have a Quaternary alluvial soil. And then this sort of more aqua colour, darker bluey green, that's the Ashfield shale, and that's sort of enriched shales as well of the Waiata Group that tend to a lot of the time occur in slightly wetter, more elevated areas, and they tend to support, taller trees and more enriched vegetation than the Bringelly shale. But the Ashfield shale there is sort of part of the Waiata Group shales. So Hawkesbury sandstone around here, like that earlier diagram I was showing, and Bringelly shale, Ashfield shale, and then Quaternary alluvium. These tiny little orangey brown polygons, they're volcanic outcrops or volcanic dikes. And you can see how limited they are in Sydney. But anywhere where there's a little volcanic outcrop or dike makes a very fertile soil. And I don't even know if these are still here or if they've been excavated or eroded. The volcanic, peaks historically tend to be readily erodible. But further up here, we've got places like Mount Tomah and Mount Wilson, really beautiful volcanic soils where there's some of Australia's best gardens you can go and see, and they're on, that's examples of sort of basalt caps or basalt outcrops, but there's not a lot of volcanic deposit in this area. So again, just getting to the rareness of Cumberland Plain woodland, or the scarcity of it now in this day and age. It's reported to have been cleared to within 2% of its original extent. So since 1788, about 98% of Cumberland Plain woodlands and Western Sydney woodlands have been cleared purely to create this, purely to create our Sydney urban environment. It's got a very sort of distinctive shape. The Sydney area almost mirrors that Cumberland Plain diagram over here. But, that's basically the suburbs of Sydney, going through here and out to Currajong and down here to Picton, Bargo, and back up this way. And you can imagine the amount of bushland clearing that's had to occur in here. Historically, a lot of this area has been farms, big farms growing all sorts of crops and other agriculture. But now, more and more, these old farms are getting subdivided and turned into new residential housing estates. So the farms in Sydney are becoming less and less. But if you keep heading out this way and you head down this way, you can still see a lot of farmland. But here's where we've had a lot of concentration of residential subdivisions and commercial and industrial development, which I guess is what you get with a city. Luckily, Sydney's bounded by national parks. Some developers get really unhappy about that, but bad luck. We've got the Royal, second oldest national park in the world, Ku-ring-gai Chase, Marra, all this Hawkesbury sandstone country, which was not as readily developable as the Waiata Shale. Here you got rolling hills, just beautiful, steady, undulating hills. The Hawkesbury Sandstone, you got a bit more cliff and precipice and that sort of thing. So engineering was a bit more challenged in these Hawkesbury Sandstone areas. You need a lot of jackhammering to get the sandstone out. Here you don't need any jackhammering, you just need bulldozers to move earth around. So it makes construction a little bit easier. But, you know, you can just see here again that, you know, so much of this has been historically cleared that, yeah, some of these ecosystems here are down to, you know, 2% of their original extent. So the Cumberland Plain, it's best known for Cumberland Plain woodland. That's an endangered ecological community, now recognised in the Sydney Basin and has been for a while. It's critically endangered under our federal and state legislation. And here's just some typical photos, you know, some monitoring plots I've been doing out here. Trees of grey box, Eucalyptus mollicana, and forest red gum, Eucalyptus teraticornis. They're two of the main trees, the most numerous trees. You can get Eucalyptus cribra, the narrow-leafed ironbark, and Eucalyptus eugenioides, the thin-leaf stringy bark. But all here, we've sort of got grey box, Eucalyptus mollicana, bit of cribra maybe. This is Cumberland Plain. Just these nice rolling hills. Up and down, no real cliffs or anything like that. It's just this nice rolling country, and you can see how it was sort of amenable to farmlands back then. A couple more photos. Sometimes the mid-story can be dense, dominated by things like Basaria spinosa, blackthorn. So things like that get added in. Really good bird habitat. Some stats, New South Wales government estimate of approximately 125,000 hectares in 1750. They like to go back to this date of 1750. Now 8% of that left in 2011. Only 9 of the 8% is on government protected lands, national parks, nature reserves, regional parks, botanic gardens. So the Mount Annan Botanic Gardens set in the Relin there, or Mount Annan. One reason it was sort of established there was to protect that patch of Cumberland Plain woodland. So it was one of the reasons they put it there, was so they could grab that Cumberland Plain woodland and conserve it and preserve it and enhance it from the weed invasion. So it's a very good example of Cumberland Plain. It was good they were able to incorporate that. The dominant eucalypts. And if you want to dive into more detail and get some really good government stats, this is the Cumberland Plain Recovery Plan. Freely downloadable. The former New South Wales Environment Department, you know, Climate Change and Water, you can download that. Pretty hefty document. And it'll list threatened ecological communities, which we usually refer to as EECs in ecology work. You don't just have Cumberland Plain woodland, you've got a variety of woodlands that are accounted for in this plan. But Cumberland Plain woodlands is one of them, you know, probably one of the former, what would you say, dominant or prominent ones in this area. But this is a document you can download. You can read all the sad news about how limited it is. And this recovery plan, as I've just said, will account for all of these endangered ecological communities and the management of them and the stats about them. So on the Cumberland Plain, we have this complexity of vegetation types, sometimes, you know, occurring on different soil substrates as well. So, for example, we've got Agnes Banks woodland, which occurs on sand, occurs on an aeolian sand deposit, which is a lot more recently deposited than a lot of these other deposits. That consists of Banksia, that's out there at a suburb called Agnes Banks. Castlereagh swamp woodland on a sort of alluvial soil that gets a little bit swampy within the Cumberland Plain. Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark Forest, that's on alluvium. Cumberland Plain woodland, moist shale woodland, that's on the shale, the Bringelly Shale. And on the creek lines where that quaternary alluvium's mapped, we get river flat eucalypt forests on coastal floodplains, shale gravel transition, shale sandstone transition forest. Now this is an interesting one. It's right where the Bringelly Shale is adjoining the Hawkesbury Sandstone, and the Hawkesbury Sandstone's starting to outcrop. And we also have a different soil deposit in between the two layers here as well, which we call the Mittagong Formation. It's a deposit called the Mittagong Formation, which it's sort of just a different sort of deposit again that's been sorted out in the geological sorting. It contains a lot of ironstone fragments. It's a nice sort of orangey brown colour a lot of the time, and it sits there between the shale and the sandstone, and it throws up this shale sandstone transition forest where you get in a bit of a marriage of Cumberland Plain woodland species and Hawkesbury sandstone species, and that's an endangered ecological community as well. And we get Western Sydney dry rainforest. That's one we get on the Cumberland Plain, sometimes in some deep gullies, shaded, sort of moist, even though it's probably in a rain shadow. And that throws up a lot of sort of, rainforest plants with this sort of a eucalypt canopy. Interesting. Get some other ones like Blue Gum High Forest, Sydney Turpentine Ironbark Forest, Sydney Freshwater Wetlands, Swamp Oak Floodplain, Castlereagh Scribbly Gum. All of these occur on the Cumberland Plain, the wider area, and some of them have got their own recovery plans. So they're not sort of included in this one because a separate recovery plan's been done, but they occur on the Cumberland Plain as well. These guys are on Ashfield Shale, that enriched Ashfield Shale. Swamp Oak floodplains on the alluvium on the creek lines, and the Scribbly Gum woodland is on the sandy alluvium. All these are different vegetation types dominated by different eucalypts. There's a lot of crossover in mid-story shrub ground layer species, but they all occur on the Cumberland Plain. It's such a diverse area. Elderslie Banksia Scrub Forest. This is another one that I've been working on down in the Camden Elderslie area. It's an EEC, an endangered community that's been cleared to within an inch of its life. There's about 10 hectares left, and the government's just trying to save what's left of it. But it's interesting, you got another aeolian sand deposit on the Nepean River, or just upslope from the Nepean. And you're getting things like Angophora subvelutina and Bangalea, Eucalyptus botryoides with Banksia integrifolia. This soil's really sandy, and it does adjoin Cumberland Plain woodland. It adjoins heavier clay soil and the Cumberland Plain woodlands in some patches, right alongside it. It's a really interesting veg type. Agnes Banks woodland looks like that. Banksia emula. We've got scribbly gums. We've got things like Angophora bakeri. Really sandy soil, and here I'm just monitoring a threatened plant, Petunia nutans, which I'll show a bit later. But yeah, this is what Agnes Banks looks like. It's a real sandy Banksia scrub, really worth visiting. This is one of my favourites, Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark Forest. This is in reserves like Castlereagh Nature Reserve out near Cranebrook, or at Cranebrook, the Penrith area. It throws up a lot of threatened shrubs, and you get a beautiful ironbark canopy, Eucalyptus fibrosa, Melaleuca decora, Melaleuca nodosa. Beautiful to walk through. I love going out here in winter. It's just glorious. Wouldn't be a fan in summer, but in winter, on a nice sunny day, walking through these woodlands, it's just a delight. It's really nice. Where it's been cleared, the Cooks River Castlereagh ironbark, it can regenerate really densely with Melaleuca shrubs. You can get these really dense shrublands, and you've got to try and walk through and do some monitoring, but that's what happens after it's been cleared. Fringing eucalypts there on the edge. This is Castlereagh Scribbly Gum woodlands. This is very similar to Agnes Banks woodlands, but it's meant to be on sort of alluvial sands. Ton of Scribbly Gum. Things like Petunia nutans. You get some sandstone species like Lambertia and Hakea, Dactyloides, Hakea laverpes, Leptospermum trinervium. You're getting those sort of genuine Hawkesbury sandstone species in here. Lamandra in the ground layer. makes for a beautiful vegetation, very sandy, a lot of threatened plant habitat in this stuff. Castlereagh swamp woodland is sort of Castlereagh scribbly gum woodland that's on sort of perch water tables and normally very moist ground. Maybe some slightly heavier alluvium that doesn't drain very well. And you get things like Parramatta red gum, Eucalyptus parramatensis, with things like Banksia oblongifolia. You'll still get scribbly gum, Eucalyptus longifolia, that's the woolly butt. You'll get that in there as well. So it's more of a swampy vegetation. Not doesn't drain very well. That's another EEC. River flat eucalypt forests on coastal floodplains. This is a really beautiful vegetation where it can grow on, the floodplain terraces of rivers and creek lines as well. It can adjoin Cumberland Plain woodlands, where the Cumberland Plain woodlands a bit further upslope. Flood prone, but it throws up things like Angophora floribunda and things like blue box, Eucalyptus boweriana. This is at Milperra. This is nearby at Voyager, Hammondville, pretty much on either side of the Georges River. Just a different sort of vegetation to the Cumberland Plain woodland, a bit wetter. Can get things like fern in the ground layer. The soil can range from a little bit sandy to sort of alluvial to a bit clayey. You can get the Cumberland Plain woodland trees in there as well, but it can be a really nice vegetation, river flat eucalypt forest, and always associated with the creek lines. This is a modified park area at Milperra where you've got remnant river flat forest trees, but it's all become sort of a picnic area on the Georges River. Where do we go after that? Okay. So just for the group, I said if you're looking at Parramatta LGA, you historically got these EECs. If you're looking at the Hills Shire, you historically got these EECs. A lot of diversity in these LGAs. So the council environmental section and the development section, they've got an obligation to try and look after these, to try and conserve them, to try and, enhance them, get some bush regen going on in there. And, we shouldn't really be ticking off, development after development, which knocks these over. Not so much these days. We tend to have a more uniform system of protecting these areas from development. So the threatened flora, just the threatened flora I've been working on in this area over, say, the last, I'd say 7 years or so with the New South Wales Saving Our Species project, which has thrown a lot of funding at research projects and monitoring of threatened plants and animals, which we've all been encouraged to see. If you just do a search of the Greater Sydney area generally, and if ecologists are working in the Sydney area generally, these are the threatened flora they're looking out for most of the time. I'm not saying it's a fully comprehensive list, but these are the usual suspects that turn up in the Greater Sydney area. So we've got representatives from a whole heap of plant families here. We've got eucalypts, we've got callistemons, grevilleas, we've got leucopogons, herbaceae. If you know Herbaceae, very diverse genus. The Herbaceae, it's very hard to keep up with which one's which. To me, the funniest thing being they found 2 critically endangered ones on Bankstown Airport alone. They found one down one end, and then they found one down another end. So you just got Bankstown Airport management pulling their hair out because they found one and then they found a second one, which was a different species. So that's the go with the herbaceae, and some of them were found on other areas like the Moorebank intermodal and a couple other areas as well. But we've got grevilleas, we've got wattles, we've got peas, stilwinias, tetrathecas, just representatives there, 2 micromyrtus. We got, the whole box and dice really. So not comprehensive lists, but that's a lot of the common ones that you're always thinking about if you're looking for threatened flora in, say, the wider Sydney area. I just, for the group, the Hills Parramatta Group, I mentioned Eucalyptus cryptica because that is a species that has recently been recognised. It was called Eucalyptus species cat-eye for a long time. It's in the Hills area, endemic to Kenthurst and Annangrove. Critically endangered, it's just been formally described, and it was previously treated as a hybrid of Notabilis and Resinifera. So it's more of a mahogany. I always thought it was like a stringy bark, but it's more of a mahogany sort of tree, yeah. But it just goes to show that we've got threatened species in Sydney that keep getting described or have only just recently been described. So we sort of think we've discovered everything, and then we have an entity like this, a taxon, that has only just been formally described as Eucalyptus cryptica. So the Sydney Basin, it keeps throwing up these nice surprises. So that's a local one for the group. Then I got on to what yes, okay, so in Cumberland Plain woodlands, one of the prominent ones is Pymelius spicata. Just a small ground cover. It's one of the real prominent threatened species on the Cumberland Plain. Known from Bankstown, Liverpool, Campbelltown, a herbarium record at Parramatta, and it's found at Penrith. It's also found at Shell Harbour, which is well outside the Cumberland Plain down the south coast. But this is one I just photographed earlier this year. There used to be a huge patch of it at Lansdowne Reserve, Lansdowne, a big Cumberland Plain reserve in the Bankstown area. We used to weed in amongst it back about 20 years ago, but when I went there this year earlier, I could hardly find any of it. It had sort of all died off. I don't know if that's due to the heavy rain, a lack of fire, something's happened to it, I'm not sure, but there was hardly any to find, and there used to be carpets and carpets of it, so that was a bit disappointing to see. I'm not sure what's going on with it there, but it's it's one everyone always looks out for. Yeah, that's just it there, creeping on the ground, not very big at this particular time that I got it. Like I said, I've seen big, huge patches of it, but it's on the shale soil. It's on Cumberland Plain woodland. It's typical clay soil. Acacia pubescens. This is another one we're familiar with in Western Sydney. The downy wattle. It's got a very distinctive look, sort of smaller bipinnate leaves that are very hairy, and flower colour, yeah, sort of a deep golden yellow a lot of the time. It rocks up in the sort of the Cooks River Castlereagh ironbark, the shale gravel transition, and it can get onto the Cumberland Plain a little bit, but it tends to like the alluvial soils. If you ever go out to this Pitt Town, Skyville area, that's Skyville National Park, Pitt Town. If you just drive the rural residential streets, you'll see copses of it in people's front yards and their road verges. Everyone out there's got it. They've just got nice copses of it, either in the big front yard or the big road verge. I don't know if they know what it is, but they seem to be happy to keep it. Maybe they're happy that it's a threatened plant. They've got it growing within their mowed sort of lawn area. It's well and truly out that way. Extending to Nowra and Ale Merton, so it gets down there towards Mittagong and down that way. This plant's known for coming up when its root fragments are transported around in earthworks. So if you've got a bulldozer there moving dirt around and there's some root fragments in there, it can happily sucker from those root fragments and get going again. It doesn't produce a lot of seed, apparently, so it's got that suckering capability. And this has happened in areas like the M5 road batters, you know, along the M5 there. If you know where they are, you see suckers coming up in those sort of those weedy, treed roadside embankments. Edge of the Cumberland Plain. I just talked about this because it's in the Hills Shire area, right up in the north towards Wiseman's Ferry. It's the Hills Shire is a massive LGA, and probably even bigger now. But you go right up here, the Wiseman's Ferry Road, to a place called South Maroota, and it's a threatened species hotspot, a threatened flora hotspot anyway. and it's areas of sandstone woodland, Hawkesbury sandstone, and shale sandstone transition. There is Cumberland Plain woodland further down the road towards Cateye, and yeah, that's where I'd say Cateye. You can see some properties with Cumberland Plain, but once you come up from Cateye, you sort of get back onto the Hawkesbury sandstone. And it's where you get the shale sandstone transition. But I wanted to throw this in because this area is just amazing for threatened flora. And this particular site I managed for 5 years under a vegetation management plan. It's recorded about 10 endangered or threatened flora species. I found at least 6 of the 10 that have been recorded. Some of them probably been recorded straight after fire and that sort of thing. But I worked on this site from about 2013 to 2021. A private, owner owned the block, wanted to subdivide it into sort of 3 10-hectare blocks and put 3 houses here, just put 3 houses up the top here. And it's got chronic bushfire risk coming from both directions. And the bushfire expert just said you can build your houses just here. And the council said the rest of this area has to go into permanent conservation. It's got to go into permanent pseudo-national park, which I thought was a good thing. So you can develop here, you can have your gardens and all that sort of thing. This is right up the top of the block. And you've got this beautiful, intact, pretty much weed-free bushland. Hopefully it stays that way. Of about 27 hectares or so, which is going to go into permanent conservation, never to be developed. So that was a pretty good outcome, I thought, and I was sort of happy with that outcome. And this is where a lot of the threatened species occur, and they sort of occur along this sort of bit as well, and right into here. So there wasn't hardly any up in here. This had been a horse paddock and bit of weed invasion and disturbed soil, but this was the project. And on this site, you have these Grevillea parviflora supplicans, Tetratheca, Micromyrtus blakeleyi, Leucopogon fletcheri, Kunzia, Pesunia hirsuta, Acacia. All of these have been recorded on this site, or at least along the road of the adjoining properties where this site is. Just an amazing threatened flora hotspot. And you could argue it's the edge of the Cumberland Plain, or Cumberland Plain, or right on the edge. That's Grevillea parviflora subspecies supplicans, which came up after fire and after a little bit of disturbance on the side of the road from the electricity people, maintaining under the power lines. It's got these cream flowers, and a lot of the time the foliage all points one way, like it's sort of seconds, what they call seconds, sort of like a toothbrush. All the leaves are sticking up in one direction. When you sort of snap off a branch, you can have a look. It's known to have that secund sort of habit. Micromyrtus blakeleyi is on the side. This is a nice little myrtle, beautiful micromyrtus. And can you believe, for one of the house builders who came along later on, I had to transplant about 40 of these out of the area where his driveway was going to go, where his driveway was proposed. And I had to dig these up, and I did it with the help of a horticultural mate of mine. We dug them up, we moved them into the conservation area, and we had about a 70% survival rate. About 70% of them survived. So we were happy with that. As far as I could see, no one else had ever attempted this. No one else had ever dug up this threatened plant and moved it. But that's what we had to do. So because this guy's driveway was just going to go straight through the middle of them. So we got permission and council, government, and that's what we went and did. That's just a removed plug. Yeah, these little bonsai things, you can sort of dig them up. And as long as you got a good root ball around the whole thing like that, with a lot of water in and some transplant shock treatment and that sort of thing, they tended to survive. So it was a good exercise. Just a transplanted plant. You can see here the soil, it's got a little bit of clay in it. There's a bit of mittagong formation here. and sandstone outcrop, and some shale interbedding. So where we're getting the shale sandstone transition, but a lot of this is what we call the Mittagong Formation. Petunia hirschshuter, that was on the site. This is one we look out for in Sydney after a fire. I only ever saw this plant once on the site, and I only saw one plant. So I saw one plant once, and when I kept going back to check on it, I could never re-find it. So I don't know if it died off really quickly. This one's known to come up after fire. And I don't think it hangs around for very long, but it's a nice hairy-leaved petunia, easy to walk over, sort of blink and you miss it, but it's another one that was growing there on the site. Just another shot of it there. Kunzea rupestris, this is a beautiful one that occurs, right on the Hawkesbury sandstone outcrop. So the Micromyrtus blakeleyi will be here as well. And the Grevillea parviflora supplicans might be just behind me with things like Leucopagan fletcheri. That's things like Angophora hispida. And these are things like Angophora bakeri, and there's Corimbia eximia and Banksia ericifolia. And you just got this beautiful Kunzea. It's an interesting Kunzea. Sort of when you look at the foliage, it's got these sort of gaps in between clusters of leaves that sort of reminds me of a bonsai sometimes when I look at it. I can't quite figure out why, but it's like got a bonsai appearance with all its clustered leaves, and then it gets these flowers on the terminals at about spring. It's pretty much known to grow in this area, this part of Sydney, South Maroota, Wiseman's Ferry. Might have a bigger range than that. But it's a beautiful plant. That's Kunzea rupestris. And I'm going to be working on this one later this year, doing a bit more mapping of it. Just some intense monitoring I did at some Western Sydney nature reserves out in this part of the world. This is Cranebrook, going up. I think that's the Northern Road there. And we head out here and we get into these beautiful Western Sydney reserves. So we've got these reserves set aside. They're meant to be, permanently protected. The thing is, they don't really have a lot of Cumberland Plain woodlands. Windsor Downs might have a little bit, but they're known for having more the Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark Forest, the Shale Gravel Transition, and the Agnes Banks woodland out here. There's a bit of Castlereagh Scribbly Gum woodlands as well, but you could sort of argue as well that I think this would be right to say that the Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark and the Shale Gravel Transition and the Agnes Banks, they've got a much lesser extent naturally than Cumberland Plain woodland. Cumberland Plain woodland was probably one of the bigger, about 125,000 hectares. It was one of the biggest sort of EECs originally. And I know a lot of it's been cleared, but it's a lot harder to find really good stands of Cooks River Castlereagh Ironbark and, Agnes Banks and Shale Gravel Transition than it is sort of Cumberland Plain woodland. So I think these reserves are, good to have them basically in these parts. Waiata Nature Reserve used to be owned by Air Services. It had some sort of airport or air services role. There's all these roads going through it, which have got these sort of aviation names. And then Castlereagh, I'm not sure what the historic sort of management is, but at one point in about 2010 or early on, these reserves were proposed for development. We had developers moving in to sort of try and buy these, where the biodiversity conservation laws and protections probably weren't as robust as they are now. So really, luckily, the government recognised their ecological value and their biodiversity value, and they got put aside for conservation. So they could have been developed. So great local campaign to ensure that. Here's one I've worked on for a while in Castlereagh and Waiata. This is Pultonea parviflora. This is a really common one you get out this way. And there's been a recent fire in these reserves, which was caused by arson in the last sort of, I don't know, 8 years, 7 years. Pretty intense fire. And thousands of these have come up after the fire. And I just go out and monitor them and do plant census and do sub-sampling and see how many plants exist in a plot and see how big they get and whether they're putting any seed on and that sort of thing. So this is a Pulcinea. It's got really small leaves. They're probably 5 mil long, probably a couple mil wide. That's one of the things that makes it identifiable. When you get the pea flowers on it, they're pretty much unmistakable. So some Cook's River Castlereagh ironbark with the Eucalyptus fibrosa and Melaleuca, and you'll just get heaps of plants coming up in this sort of area, and we'll put down a monitoring plot and sort of count them and measure them and see whether they're flowering and that sort of thing. There's a whole forest of them in the shrub layer anyway. These are generally up to about 1 metre tall, but there's a whole forest of them coming up after fire. So these peas, they respond to a fire really well a lot of the time. Also in amongst these, you've got other threatened flora as well. So these reserves are hotspots for a variety of flora too. You've got things like Dilwinia tenuifolia and Grevillea juniperina. They're coming in amongst these as well. So we've actually got plots here where we're monitoring one threatened plant, but we've actually got sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 threatened shrubs growing in these sort of areas. Just another plot. That's a whole forest again of Pulcinea parviflora. There's Dilwinia tenuifolia. Maybe a bit of Micromyrtus minutiflora as well. All going on here. So yeah, it's a really good result after the fire, even though the fire was deliberately lit. Dilwinia tenuifolia, that's one that's out there as well. It's a bit like the South Maruda area. It's another threatened flora hotspot. So this is another pea that's out there. Really narrow leaves, the wider Dilwinia flowers, and that'll happily grow with the Pulcinea. Gets into Rookwood Cemetery, that one as well. Yep, growing there with it. Grevillea juniperina, subspecies juniperina. So there's about 6 subspecies of this Grevillea juniperina. It's a real species complex, but the one in Western Sydney is known to be this one, and the flowers can range from cream to sort of peachy cream. It's a common plant in cultivation, juniperina, but this subspecies taxon is meant to be threatened and, restricted to the Sydney area. Around this Cranebrook area, you can see a ton of it growing on the side of the road, growing on, the road batters on the side. It sort of likes disturbance, but it's really common in these nature reserves out here, like Waiata and Castlereagh. So very prickly. So that's around as well. Just get some copses of it there. We've got the Pulcinea parviflora. We've got Grevillea juniperina. We've got Micromyrtus minutiflora as well, and probably some Dilwinia tenuifolia. They're all here. And there's the houses across the road. So that's the start of the residential, development across the road. And been a bit of disturbance here over time, but plenty of threatened shrubs through these patches. Just another example there. Grevillea gets up to, 1.5 metres, 2 metres. Very prickly to walk through, bit painful. That's all the Micromyrtus minutiflora there. And yeah, the Pulcinea. We're monitoring Pulcinea in this patch. Grevillea, we've got Pulcinea here as well. There's a whole heap of Pulcinea over here, but that's your typical Grevillea coming up. It's very easily identifiable with the arching stems, prickly leaves, Grevillea flowers. Micromyrtus minutiflora. So like the Blakeleyi at South Maruda, this one's a fair bit taller and a bit more straggly. They look a bit miserable, these guys. They always look like they're sort of half dead. I don't know if that was because of all the recent rain when I was doing my monitoring, like the rain we've had generally from 2020 to 2023 or 4, or 2022 anyway, well above average. They're just these tall, spindly shrubs, but they've got a very, very localised distribution, basically between Penrith and Richmond. They don't go further than that. Just did a bit of monitoring on this one in Parramatta and Castlereagh. There's thousands of them, but like I said, this plant sort of exists in an area of, I don't know, 10 by 10 kilometres, or might be 15 by 15 or something like that. It's not found anywhere else on the earth. So there is a lot of it, but we just keep an eye on it for the project to see how it goes long term. That's a whole sort of patch of it there in the mid-story. So you can walk through here, and there's a ton of this micromyrtus. They grow very densely together. It's really hard to tell whether some of them are, when they're multi-stemmed, are they the same plant or different plants? Have they thrown a heap of seed and there's just a whole heap of clustered stems coming up together? Just makes it a bit hard to tell. Unsure whether they're all seedlings or suckers or something like that. But they're here in pretty good numbers. And sometimes the foliage can have a bit of a reddy brown tinge to it. I'm not sure if that was too much rain, but they're on the alluvial soil here. Reddy brown, reddy sort of green foliage there. They had a lot of that and a bit of dieback a lot of the time. I put that down to wet conditions, but I wasn't sure. Going through like dense stands, regenerating stands of Kunzia ambigua. A lot of it growing up under there, sort of struggling to get up into the sunlight. So we were measuring plants like this as well. So you get down on your hands and knees and measure a few micromyrtus. Sometimes they'd be growing in these sort of almost these dead zones, I think, where there's been a bit of soil modification over time, and these regenerating Kunzia patches. But you get micromyrtus, flora in these sort of hard alluvial pans, or might be moving into the clay side of things. Not a lot of ground layer, everything's sort of looking a bit dead, bit of lichen cover. But you got micromyrtus here, sort of a lot of dieback a lot of the time, and wanted to monitor these ones to see if they were going to regenerate or recover. On the last one now, I think, Petunia newtons. This is a really popular one on the Cumberland Plain, one that a lot of people have worked on. A good one to get familiar with. It's called the nodding G-bung. Should have put that there, nodding G-bung. It sort of weeps over. These sort of linear leaves, maybe up to about 5 centimetres long or so. Not sort of as long as linearis, but that sort of width. Red stems, solitary flowers, and it tends to sort of weep over. Restricted to the Cumberland Plain, Richmond, Macquarie Fields. There's last populations in Londonderry and Castlereagh. Scattered records down to the south coast hinterland. And it can get it's a nice genuine shrub, 3 metres by 5 metres. So they do get a good spread on them. This was them in Windsor Downs Nature Reserve, I think, where they have actually planted some. They've actually cultivated some Petunia newtons, the government, and they've planted it. And here I was monitoring natural plants and planted plants. And the planted ones are doing okay. They're actually doing pretty good for now. So it's good to see some planting of these guys going on. They've gotten nice and big. Some areas in Castlereagh where you got these sort of lateritic dead zones, I tend to call them, these lateritic sort of sun-baked outcrops, where you have things like Alocasuarina and scribbly gum, and you get a lot of Petrophily and Isopogon and those sort of plants. But there's Petunia newtons hanging in here, I think, in this monitoring plot. These ones might have been planted as well. I can't quite remember. It loves the Castlereagh scribbly gum woodland. That shot I showed before. There's all Petunia newtons through here. Nice, big, broad plants spreading to several metres wide. They've probably come up after fire. They don't mind the fire. They'll happily regenerate after that, and then hopefully throw a lot of seed back into the soil, which hopefully can get through this thick sort of bark litter and sit there until the next fire. But these guys were looking pretty healthy on the whole, even though they're sort of restricted to these areas, and they love the Agnes Banks as well, Agnes Banks woodland. This isn't too far from Londonderry, I don't think. Petunia Newton's all through here, just all through this plot with Banksia emula. Banksia serrata is meant to be here as well, and things like Eucalyptus paramatensis and what we used to call sclerophylla or racemosa now, the scribbly gum. Very sandy soil, a lot of ant activity, and it's a stronghold for Petunia Newtons. So you can go for a bushwalk into these areas. There's nothing stopping you going in. You can go for a walk, have a look around. They're really great that they're preserved in Western Sydney. There's a shot of it there. Sometimes they'd have these sort of black bits of dye back on them. Not sure what that was. It was looked like a bit of a fungus on the leaves. You can see the flowers. Possibly some fruit developing there. Nice red stems on Petunia Newtons. And I went back to that slide, possibly because that's where I wanted to finish, yeah. So, yeah, thanks for that, folks. That was a summary, or tried to make it a summary, a repeat of the talk I gave. So, hopefully you enjoyed that one. I'll wrap it up there, and any comments, please, or questions, please put them in. Happy botanising.